Most headaches are harmless, but a small number are a warning signal you should not ignore. The goal here is simple: help you recognize red flags that suggest something more serious than a typical tension headache or migraine. You do not need to diagnose yourself. You just need to know when to get urgent medical help and when to book a routine check-in. Think of headaches in two buckets: primary headaches, like migraine or tension, and secondary headaches caused by another problem. The warning signs are mostly about sudden changes: how fast it starts, how intense it is, and what else comes with it. If your headache feels different from your usual pattern, that matters. If it comes with neurological symptoms, that matters even more. And if it follows an injury, a fever, or a major health change, that should raise your attention. Let's walk through the most important signs, one by one, in plain language. Moving to slide 2. First red flag: a headache that reaches maximum intensity very fast. People often describe it as a thunderclap headache, like a switch flipped. It can peak in under a minute, and it can feel like the worst headache of your life. That description is not about drama. It's about speed and severity. A sudden, explosive onset can be associated with bleeding around the brain, problems with blood vessels, or other emergencies that need immediate evaluation. Sometimes it happens during exertion, sex, coughing, or straining. Sometimes it comes out of nowhere. Even if the pain starts to fade, the initial pattern still counts. If you have a headache that peaks instantly, especially if it's new for you, treat it as urgent. The safest move is emergency assessment, because timing matters for certain causes. Don't wait to see if it passes when the onset is that abrupt. Moving to slide 3. Second red flag: a headache with new neurological symptoms. That includes weakness on one side, facial droop, trouble speaking, confusion, fainting, or a seizure. It also includes new vision changes, like double vision, loss of vision, or a curtain-like shadow. Migraine can cause neurological symptoms too, like aura, but the key word is new. If you've never had those symptoms before, or they are more intense or longer than your usual aura, that's a reason to get checked urgently. Another clue is progression. If symptoms are worsening over minutes, or you can't think clearly, don't try to push through it. A clinician may need to rule out stroke, bleeding, infection, or pressure problems. The practical rule is simple: headache plus a new neurological deficit equals don't drive yourself, get help. Moving to slide 4. Third red flag: fever, stiff neck, or a headache that comes with feeling severely unwell. A mild headache with a common cold is one thing, but a strong headache with high fever, neck stiffness, light sensitivity, or a new rash can point toward infections that involve the brain or its lining. People sometimes describe neck stiffness as being unable to comfortably touch the chin to the chest. Another concerning sign is altered mental status: extreme sleepiness, irritability, or confusion. Not every fever and headache combo is dangerous, but when the headache is intense and the illness feels out of proportion, it's safer to get assessed quickly. Dehydration can also worsen headaches, but dehydration does not usually explain severe neck stiffness or confusion. If you're unsure, err on the side of medical evaluation, especially for children, older adults, or anyone immunocompromised. Moving to slide 5. Fourth red flag: a new headache after a head injury, even a minor one. The concern is not only the immediate concussion symptoms, it's also delayed bleeding, especially in older adults, people on blood thinners, or anyone with a bleeding disorder. Watch for headache that is worsening instead of improving, repeated vomiting, increasing sleepiness, confusion, or new balance problems. Another pattern is a headache that wakes you from sleep after an injury, or one that keeps getting stronger over a day or two. If the person can't recall details of the event, that also matters. Many post-injury headaches are benign, but you can't reliably tell without context. If there's any doubt, especially with risk factors like anticoagulants, it's reasonable to seek prompt medical evaluation rather than waiting it out at home. Moving to slide 6. Fifth red flag: a headache that is new after age 50, or a headache pattern that changes significantly later in life. Migraine often begins earlier, so a brand new headache in midlife or later deserves a careful look. One specific concern is temporal arteritis, also called giant cell arteritis. It can cause scalp tenderness, jaw pain when chewing, and sometimes vision symptoms. Another concern is that secondary causes, like medication side effects, blood pressure issues, or other medical conditions, become more common with age. The key is not to panic. It's to avoid assuming it's just stress when it's a new pattern. If you're over 50 and you develop a persistent new headache, or your usual headaches change character, frequency, or severity, that's a good reason to book a timely medical appointment. Moving to slide 7. Sixth red flag: headaches linked to position or pressure changes. If your headache is clearly worse when you lie down or worse when you stand up, that pattern can be important. Headache worse lying flat can be associated with increased pressure inside the skull. Headache that improves when lying down but worsens upright can sometimes happen after a spinal fluid leak, including after certain procedures, but it can also occur for other reasons. Another clue is pain that spikes with coughing, sneezing, or straining. That doesn't automatically mean something dangerous, but it is a classic reason clinicians ask more questions. If positional headaches are new, persistent, or paired with symptoms like vision changes, pulsating whooshing in the ears, or nausea that won't settle, it's worth medical evaluation rather than self-treating repeatedly. Moving to slide 8. Seventh red flag: headache with eye pain or sudden eye changes. If one eye is red and painful, with blurred vision, halos around lights, or nausea, that can be a sign of acute glaucoma, which is time-sensitive. Another concern is pain with eye movement or new double vision. Even without severe pain, sudden partial vision loss is not something to watch at home. Cluster headaches can cause severe one-sided pain with tearing and nasal congestion, and they are not usually dangerous, but they can mimic more serious problems. The point is not to self-label. It's to recognize that the eye is part of the story. If your headache comes with a new visual deficit, a painful red eye, or a drooping eyelid, get evaluated urgently. Vision is one area where delays can have real consequences. Moving to slide 9. Eighth red flag: a headache that is steadily worsening over days to weeks, or one that becomes more frequent and harder to control. A slow build can happen with many non-dangerous issues like stress, sleep disruption, or medication overuse, but a progressive pattern also raises the need to rule out secondary causes like pressure changes, inflammation, or more rarely, a mass. Pay attention to headaches that start waking you from sleep or that are consistently worse in the morning with nausea. Another clue is a headache that no longer responds to what used to help, or that changes location and quality. Keep it practical. Track when it happens, how long it lasts, and what else is going on. Then bring that pattern to a clinician. Progression is a signal to investigate, not a reason to tough it out. Moving to slide 10. Ninth red flag: headaches in the context of pregnancy or the postpartum period. Hormones, sleep loss, and dehydration can trigger migraines, so headaches are common. But pregnancy also changes blood pressure and clotting risk. A severe headache with high blood pressure readings, swelling, shortness of breath, or visual symptoms can be associated with preeclampsia or related conditions. Another concern is a blood clot in the veins that drain the brain, which can present with headache and neurological symptoms. The safest approach is to treat severe, new, or unusual headaches during pregnancy or after delivery as a reason to contact a healthcare professional promptly. If there's confusion, weakness, seizure, or sudden severe onset, that's emergency level. It's not about fear. It's about recognizing that the risk profile is different in this life stage. Moving to slide 11. 10th red flag: headaches affected by medications or substances in a way that suggests rebound or toxicity. One common trap is medication overuse headache. If you take frequent pain relievers or migraine meds, headaches can start happening more often, and the relief window gets shorter. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means the nervous system can become sensitized. Another concern is headaches with very high blood pressure, especially with chest pain, shortness of breath, or neurological symptoms. Also note carbon monoxide exposure. Headache with dizziness and nausea that improves when you leave a space can be a clue, especially if multiple people in the same home feel sick. The action step here is pattern recognition. If headaches are becoming near daily or tied to frequent rescue meds, bring it up with a clinician so they can review safer strategies. Moving to slide 12. Now let's turn all of this into a simple decision tool you can actually use. Ask yourself 3 questions. 1. Is this headache sudden and maximal, or the worst I've ever had? 2. Is there anything new alongside it? Weakness, confusion, fever, stiff neck, fainting, seizure, or vision loss? 3. Is my situation higher risk? Recent head injury, pregnancy or postpartum, immune suppression, cancer history, or blood thinners? If the answer is yes to question 1 or 2, treat it as urgent. If the answer is yes to question 3, lower your threshold to get checked. If none of those apply, and the headache fits a familiar pattern, it's often reasonable to monitor and plan a routine visit if it's recurring. The goal is not to memorize every condition, it's to notice the red flag pattern and act early. Moving to slide 13. To wrap up, headaches are common, and most are not dangerous. But the red flags are consistent. Sudden thunderclap onset, new neurological symptoms, fever with stiff neck, post-injury worsening, new headache after 50, strong positional patterns, eye pain or vision loss, progressive change over weeks, pregnancy-related severe headaches, and concerning medication or exposure patterns. If you're ever unsure, it's reasonable to seek medical guidance because the cost of missing a serious cause can be high. If you want one practical habit, keep a simple headache log: onset speed, severity, duration, triggers, and any associated symptoms. That makes medical visits far more efficient. For a quick check-in, have you ever had a headache that felt meaningfully different from your usual pattern? Yes or no? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want more clear, calm health explainers like this, subscribe. This information is not a substitute for medical advice.